Hey there, and thanks for watching. So, as many of you know, I've recently been enamored with the emergence of AGI, artificial general intelligence, and in particular, ChatGPT, GPT-4, and these natural language models that become called an assistant to us as we're working. And I've shared numerous videos and posts on different ways in which I'm using it. I wanted to show you another use case. This one was particularly fun. And so let me set it up for you. So we have this add-in, an Excel add-in. If you're unfamiliar with an Excel add-in, it's basically a software program that attaches to Excel that expands the capability of Excel. And this add-in, what it did was it auto-populated the latitude and longitude based on an address that you input into a cell. And it connected with Google's geocoding API in order to accomplish this. And in order to build the add-in, we released it, I don't know, a few years ago. And the reason we did it is because that was a task I like to do. And so I thought, oh, let me find someone that'll create this add-in for me, and then I'll just share it with the a.cre audience. And so I contacted a developer, Anand, phenomenal VBA developer, and over several months, he built for me and for us, for the a.cre community, what we call the geocoding Excel add-in. And we've had it on our website for several years. And recently I got thinking, you know what, I want to expand that add-in to be more of a general purpose add-in for real estate financial modeling professionals. So it does more than just geocoding. And so I have all sorts of ambitions for this. I've had several add-ins installed on my Excel. They're slow. Most of the features I don't really use or I need. And so I thought I'm going to create a custom one that I'm going to use for all of my models. And so I had two options. The first option, which is I had several options. The first option is to go back to Anand, and great developer, but and you know, it's not so much about having to pay him for his time because he's well worth his time, but it's more about the time at which I would give him instruction. He'd go back, he'd put some code together, he'd test, he'd send it to me. I'd want to make this tweak, or I'd make that tweak, and I'd want to do this or that. And you know, this wasn't exactly what I was thinking. And the iterative back and forth could take months just to get what I wanted. The second option was to learn VBA and do it on my own. Well, I'm busy between Stablewood and Adventures in CRE and my family. I just don't have time to learn, let alone to build that sort of code. And so the third option is new, right? The third option is to turn to a tool like ChatGPT and have it help me expand this model. And so that's what I did. So over the next few minutes, I'm going to show you one of the features that I added to the add-in. I did it on a Saturday afternoon. I think it took me in all 20 minutes to do this, and maybe another 10, 15 of testing. So you're talking less than an hour, and I created a whole new feature in the add-in. And then you're going to see that I've added several features now to this Excel add-in. I've rebranded it the Excel for CRE add-in. Yeah, clever, I know. And in the coming months and years, as you know, I have things I want to add. So for instance, I'm going to create a tool that will automatically pull in, say, the forward yield curve that I'll use in my floating rate modules. And I'm going to put it in this add-in. I'll share it on Adventures in CRE for any of those of you who want to see it. So, but let's get into this particular feature. So what you're looking at right now is the initial prompt that I fed to ChatGPT's GPT-4. And what I was looking to accomplish is I wanted a feature that would auto-generate my date header. So in real estate financial modeling, if you're unfamiliar with the date header, and let me show you the feature first, and then I'll show you how it was built. What a date header is, it's basically the financial header that sits at the top of your model that differentiates one period the next, and then your cash flows go below it. So in a traditional model, if I were to do it by hand, I'd have an analysis start date, right? And then let's put maybe January 1st, 2025 as my analysis start date. And then I would have, call it, I don't know, my month. And we start with month 0. And then we're going to have months going out in the future. And for now, let's just go, so we're not too far off the screen. Let's just go out to a year. 12 months. And then I'm going to have a date. I'm going to use an EO month. I'll grab my start date and I'll go to the last day of the previous month. And then I would go forward 1 month. Okay. And I've done this so many times, it doesn't take me very long to build one of these things. But it does. I mean, at the end of this, if I were to go out 120 months and do it right, it's a 3, 4, 5 minute exercise. Possibly there's errors in how it's done. Where this one, and let me do the year. So I'm at 12, 0. So this is the year. And so if we have 12 months plus times 0, whoops. If you have 12 months plus times 0, you're all either year 0 or you're year 1. But as we continue out to the right, you get into year 2. So that's a date header. And so I thought, and here you see I have the plugin, the add-in installed, and I have this feature called Create Date Header. And this will automatically generate the date header for me. So I click it, and it asks, do you want to automatically create a date header? I say yes. It asks, where's the analysis start date? It's there. Do I want months, quarters, or years for periods? I'm going to start with months. How many years is your analysis period? Let's do 10. That's 120. And then where do I want the header to start? I'm going to start right there. Hit OK, and it's done. And so now I've got a header, and I go all the way out to the right, and I've got 120 periods. It does this because I need to widen my rows, but you get a sense, 120 periods, and it's that easy. So I come back to my ChatGPT window. I ask ChatGPT to essentially create that. And then we go into, and if you've watched any of these other videos, it's a dialogue between me and this tool. And in a way, it's the same dialogue I would have with Anand, my developer. Only the time that it would take between me and him going back and forth would be months. And I kid you not, it's months because he's busy, he's doing other projects, he's a contractor. And so I give a prompt. And then ChatGPT, based on the prompt, gives me some instruction. Now what's interesting is this first instruction, partly because my prompts are not as good as they could be. Part of it is because ChatGPT doesn't always understand. Part of it is I'm learning as I'm going as well. Part of it is sometimes is GPT-4 is not perfect. It makes errors, and you catch the errors and you point it out. So, for instance, I get through the first one and I say, hey, let's modify this code. Instead of the user manually typing in the cell reference, have the user choose the cell. So what happened in the first iteration? I had this vision where the user would click on the cell where the analysis start date was. Well, the code that had been created required the user to manually enter the cell reference. And I didn't think that was the optimal strategy. So I said, hey, let's modify this code. Now, I have the benefit, and this is one of the keys to prompt engineering is the benefit of understanding the code at a general level. And therefore, I knew to say, okay, let's, instead of the user manually typing in the cell reference, let's have the user choose the cell reference by clicking the cell reference. And ChatGPT modified the code. And I said, one other thing to change, rather than automatically starting the date header in cell B1, and that's because that's where in the previous code, it required the user to have the date header, or it just automatically created the date header in cell B1. Let's ask the user to choose in which cell the date header should begin. And that way the user, you remember when we did that, we had to select where the date header began. The user could choose where it would be dropped into their worksheet. And so again, some revised code to do that. And I said, great, now let's improve the macro further. So what had happened is as ChatGPT would drop in code, I would drop it into the add-in and then I would test it. I just see it really quick and I go, oh, okay, well, and this is the sort of thing where I would go back to my developer and I'd say, great, it's working, but I've now noticed that the functionality I'd asked for isn't exactly what I want. Let's improve it further. And I said, immediately below the date header row, I'd like to create a row that is the month, quarter, or year row. This row outputs a numeric value that represents which month, quarter, or year the date above represents. Now, the other reason I did this is the code here, this initial code that ChatGPT produced, I asked it only produce one row, and that was simply the dates. And I did that to keep it iterative and simple, so that I knew my prompts were generally correct. And so my second step was, okay, let's make the second row. And the second row is basically which period are we in? And are we using months, quarters, or years? It created some code. I said, that works great, but rather than hard-coded values, I'd prefer formulas in the cell. What it did with this code is it just simply dropped in the values, which is awesome, except for what I wanted was formulas. If I go back to the worksheet, what you'll see is every one of these cells actually has a formula. And why does that matter? Well, for one, it makes it dynamic. I can change this date to February 1st, and the header automatically updates. The other thing I can do is I can copy this header, and I can put it anywhere. And because the formulas are there, each one of these headers is dynamic to my analysis start date. So that's what I asked next. Hey, I said to ChatGPT, hey, that's great, but your values are hard-coded. I want formulas. And I gave it the formulas I wanted. Again, this is where the prompt engineer comes in. I knew the formula I wanted, and I knew the references for those formulas. Now, if I didn't know the formulas, ChatGPT would have suggested its own formulas. And I'm sure it would have come up with a correct formula that would have worked. I have a preference for EO month when I'm doing my data headers, and so I asked it to use EO month. But so that's my second prompt. It then generated this code. Again, working great. In finance, and now I educate ChatGPT a little bit. In finance, the first period is called period 0. It represents everything that happened up until that point. As a result, we need to make the following changes. So what it had done up until this point is it started with period 1. Well, what we always start with is a period 0. That's our very first period. And then following that is period 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth. And so I wanted to ensure that the first period was 0. But what that also meant is that if you have a 10-year analysis period, you have 10 periods plus 1. Or in the case of monthly periods, 120 periods plus 1. And I gave it some instruction. I said, hey, in row 1, the macro should output one additional period beyond what the user selects. So if the user chooses, and I gave an example. The user chooses 10 years with monthly periods, 10 times 12, there should be 121 periods. And I gave it kind of some general math. And that was to ensure that it got it right. And it gave me that, and it says, looks like you made an error. This wasn't because I gave it the wrong prompt. GPT-4, and I'm sure OpenAI will improve with each subsequent version, sometimes is wrong. And in this case, it created code that resulted in a 10-year analysis period with months having 1,441 periods. It added a 0 on one of the calculations. And so I said, hey, looks like there's an error. In testing, I chose monthly periods and 10 years, and it returned 1,441 periods. Please let me know which part of the code to change to fix the issue. No need to give me the entire code over again, just the part to fix. So remember, each time it's feeding me code, it's giving me all of the code, which is fine. But number one, it's using up bandwidth on its end, but also it's just overloading. I don't need the entire code. And so what it does is it apologizes. It looks like the code is working correctly for quarters and years, which is awesome. It automatically looked back and said, okay, let me make sure quarters and years are working. I didn't tell it that quarters and years were working. It figured that out on its own. And then it said, the issue lies in the calculation of num periods. Please change. And then it gave me the lines that I needed to change. These lines to this. And this change separates the addition that gives me the explanation. And I was so happy. I said, excellent. Let's finish by adding an optional third row. So now I'm going to the third row. So now my first row is working correctly. My second row is working correctly. The third row, and as you read it here, should only appear when the user chooses M or Q. And up above, that was a input that the user enters whether they choose months, quarters, or years, Y, and is calculated by rounding up with no decimal places the value in the second row divided either by 12 for M or 4 for Q. Now, again, this is where the prompt engineer is key. Now, I probably could have explained what I really wanted. I should say, I probably could have explained what I wanted without the math, and ChatGPT eventually would have got it. In this case, I just told it exactly what it needed to do. Now, I don't know the VBA code, but I know the math. And so I said, what I need is to take the period above in the second row. So let's say you're in month 23 and we are on monthly periods. Take that, divide it by 12 and round up to the nearest value with no decimal places. And then I said, in other words, add a formula in the third row for each period that is round up period value divided by 12 in the case of M, or period value divided by 4 in the case of Q. And then I do this comma 0. And that's related to the roundup function in Excel. Additionally, please add notes within the code so that others who view the code know what that section does. And what you'll see is you'll come down and sure enough, calculate the number of periods. They added generate the date header numeric value. Not only did ChatGPT add that piece, but also then began adding notes in the code that other users who view the code can understand what the code is doing. And now here's something interesting. You may have run into this if you use ChatGPT. It oftentimes, when it gets when it has a long piece of data that it's trying to output, it will end. I think it's a constraint on OpenAI's side. When that happens, all you have to say is, hey, seems you stopped. Please continue the code starting from, and I told him where in the code it stopped. And ChatGPT said, apologies for the truncation, continuing the code from where it was cut off, and it finished up the code. And then I said, okay, let's add the third row logic. Please suggest the code to change in add the optional third row section such that the third row starts in period 0. So there was an issue. The code that ChatGPT had produced wasn't starting with a time 0 for some reason. So it only started in 1, and the very first period was just blank. I'm not sure why ChatGPT did that. I gave it some instruction. It updated. It again stopped, and then excellent. One final feature. So we got there. Excellent. One final feature I'd like to add. And so what I basically asked it to do is add a label at the front of each row that denotes what that row is. Period ending, analysis month, analysis year. And it would say analysis quarter if we're using quarters, or analysis year if it's just years. And so it does that. Again, it stopped because it got too long, finished. Sorry, I wasn't clear. So the instructions I gave were not clear. And the reason why I said I want to period ending label to begin in the date header start and the analysis month and analysis year to immediately be below that. Then each row will start one. So I didn't give the proper instructions. I believe this fixed it. Oh, unfortunately, that didn't work. It seems the period 0 and the period 1 through N refers to the previous cell. So I gave it some additional instruction, gave me code, and then it again didn't work. And so I'm like, okay, let's fix these lines. It should have conditional logic such that the user, actually, I think it partly fixed it. And the problem was that in the case of quarters, it wasn't putting analysis quarter. It just said analysis month. And so I asked it to say analysis quarter if the user selects Q. And great. Now, I then went through the code. And there were some very minor things that I was like, I'll just edit the code on my own. So one of them was the formatting for dates. I changed the format to day and then a 3-letter month and then the year. Some little things like that. And so I told ChatGPT, hey, here's the code. I made some edits. Here's the code so that ChatGPT is aware of the code I'm currently working with. So then it noticed and called out the changes that I'd made. So for instance, it said, you added the following lines at the beginning of the code to provide the user with an option to run the tool or not. And you added the corresponding end if, and you added a new comment. And so it mentioned the things that I'd added, which apparently I didn't add the date change. I turned screen updating off and on. I added some notes. I added the created by Spencer Burton with the help of ChatGPT on this date. And I said, excellent, there is a bug we need to fix. So then I did some tests. And I did the test, and I told ChatGPT, hey, I noticed this bug. The macro assumes that there's a value in the cell selected for the start date. It made a change. Let's make a couple more tweaks. Let's label the dialog box this, and rather than simply ending the macro that, and it made some changes to code that worked and found another issue. It made those updates just to confirm. I replaced the file, and it gave me some code, but I wasn't clear on its instructions, so I asked for it to clarify, and it clarified exactly what I needed to do. And I said, this code worked for the period type. However, when I clicked the cancel, and then there was this issue, and again, this was like a testing exercise going back and forth. It fixed it. And now I should have said, thank you, we're all set. And you're welcome. I'm glad we could address all the issues and improve the macro together. If you have any further questions or need assistance in the future, please don't hesitate to ask. Have a great day. And so that was my conversation back and forth with ChatGPT, creating this one feature in now a comprehensive or growing to be a comprehensive Excel add-in. So I hope you found that as interesting as I did. It was a fun exercise. We've since released the Excel add-in. It's free, the Excel for CRE add-in. I'll drop a link in down below on how you can go download that add-in and play around with it. I left the code open, so anyone can come in here and see, say, that code that we were just looking at in ChatGPT is under CRE content, generate date header. You can come in and check out the code, but the code for the entire add-ins here, feel free to modify it yourself, use it to whatever extent you find helpful. And otherwise, best of luck to you, and we'll see you on the next one.